Hello everybody and welcome back to another Overwatch League Season 2 weekly preview video here on my channel. Week 1, of course, has concluded. There were quite a few upsets, some games that went further than expected, some teams who performed a lot better than I expected, some teams who underperformed, and a lot of stuff in Week 1. And I realized that picking for Week 1 well in advance when you don't know any of the teams is really hard, and your record usually shows that you didn't do super well. So let's jump into my picks from last week, how I did, and then we'll start talking about Week 2. So, for Week 1, my big pick record, not great, especially in the first 2 days. I went 0-2 in the first 2 days, but I went 2-0 in the second 2 days, so sitting at 2-2. For the first week, that's pretty good. Of course, Fusion taking the victory over the Spitfire in the first game of the season. I can't talk. First game of the season. Really big win for the Fusion. It was very dominant. They looked like the much better team in that game. And I'll start talking about some of my takeaways and whatnot when we get to the standings in a little bit. But I thought the Fusion looked very good in that game. Other games from that day, the New York Excelsior, of course, won against the Boston Uprising in a very, very interesting game, a game where the Boston Uprising really impressed me, even though they lost. They looked very good in that loss. Seoul Dynasty getting the win over the LA Gladiators. It was a 3-1 game, a lot closer than the 3-1 score would have suggested. And the Hangzhou Spark and Shanghai Dragons, pretty one-sided match, but the Shanghai Dragons are a team that I want to talk about in a little bit, about kind of their look right now. That was the first day, of course. Friday, we had the Toronto Defiant beating the Houston Outlaws, Atlanta Reign beating the Florida Mayhem, San Francisco Shock beating the Dallas Fuel very convincingly, and my other big pick game that I got wrong in the first 2 days, the Chengdu Hunters beating the Guangzhou Charge. Saturday, Paris Eternal came away with the win against London. Thanks, London. New York taking another win. First team to reach 2-0 on the season, beating the Washington Justice. And then they were immediately followed up by another team that has started 2-0, the Hangzhou Spark. And my big pick game for Saturday was the Vancouver Titans against the Shanghai Dragons, which originally I expected, of course, that to be a much better game, where the Dragons wouldn't have an issue of not having a main tank, but they ultimately did not. Then we get to Sunday, where the Houston Outlaws were once again defeated, this time by the Boston Uprising. Though, of course, Houston's losses were both 5-map losses, so there is something in that. The Philadelphia Fusion won in an incredible matchup against the Atlanta Reign. That is my game of the week. If you did not see that game, I highly recommend you watch it. It was incredible. The LA Gladiators squeaking out a win against the San Francisco Shock. Those 3 games all were 5 maps. And then the Dallas Fuel came out with a win against the Seoul Dynasty. So very, very interesting week. I went 9-7 overall, 2-2 on my big pick games. My storylines, 2 teams that I really want to highlight. The Houston Outlaws and the London Spitfire in terms of that disappointment category. London, this just doesn't look like a meta that they're good at. It looks like a meta they probably won't be very good at in the long run in general. The best they looked was, in my opinion, Paris Eternal game on Kings Row with Guard playing Sombra. They were very dominant in that game. That, to me, was the best they looked so far this season. Not even really much of a question. I just think they looked much more poised, and I think that when they're not doing that traditional 3-3, when they can break out of that 3-3, I think they look better. But in the current meta, they don't look very good. So London, I think, is going to have a tough time getting going here in the first couple of weeks, and even potentially in the first stage or two. So if they don't get things going, and once we start getting into stage 2, London might be a team that we start seeing hitting the bottom of that ranking and missing out on the playoffs. Houston Outlaws, another team, of course, like. They have a really tough week too, which we'll get into here in a little bit, and I really don't know how they lost both of these games. The Toronto Defiant are a new team, without arguably their best player in Neko, and Houston couldn't beat them. Got reverse swept by them. Then you have the Boston Uprising, who just got rid of their team captain and main tank Gamsu, and had to bring up a player from their contenders team who was on a two-way contract, of course, but that would be Fusion's, who was a very good player. He impressed me in the World Cup. He impressed me against New York. He impressed me again against Houston. But at the end of the day, I just think that there's something very clear with the Houston Outlaws that isn't going well. They shouldn't have lost both of these games, yet they did. In my opinion, they shouldn't have lost them. And I'm really concerned about the Houston Outlaws going forward and how well they've been playing, or how they've been playing. To me, it's a bit of a problem. Another team, of course, that did not get a single win in the opening week is the Shanghai Dragons, but I think the Shanghai Dragons deserve a little bit of flack, or a little bit of slack, not flack, a little bit of slack, just because of the fact that they are just now getting Gamsu in. They didn't have him with the team until recently. I think that you have to look at the Shanghai Dragons. They had a tough opening week. They play one game next week, and I believe they don't play again until late in the third week, or if they even play in the third week. So I think Shanghai will start to get better as the season progresses, and I think as Stage 1 progresses, they'll get better. But right now, I think they have a tough opening schedule, and that's a big part of why I think they lost. I'd say my team of the week, the team that I think looked the best consistently, probably the Fusion or the Spark. If you start 2-0, you're doing pretty well. NYXL looked good, of course, as well. Not so much against Boston. I think they struggled against Boston, but I've accepted the fact that anytime you doubt Boston, you just end up being wrong, so it's a good idea to just not doubt Boston anymore. I thought their win against the Justice was much, much more convincing. And while it was only a 3-1 victory instead of a 4-0 victory, I believe a lot of that came down primarily to just they wanted to try something weird on Horizon Nerd Colony that didn't work that well against Boston, and they did it again, and it didn't work that well either. So we'll see what happens going forward. But that's kind of my biggest takeaway. The team that surprised me the most was the Atlanta Reign. Their game against Philadelphia was really good. They played really well, and I thought that they looked like one of the best teams in the league, especially one of the best expansion teams in the league, pretty consistently there. So those are my thoughts on this first week. So let's take a look at my picks for week 2. So day 1, interesting slate of games. In my opinion, they're all pretty one-sided games. Picking my big pick game was pretty hard, but I ultimately decided to go with the Dallas Fuel and the Guangzhou Charge, primarily because they were the closest two teams in my power rankings, and while Guangzhou lost, I was actually impressed with the way they played. I thought they played pretty well. I thought they performed pretty well, and I think they'll be an interesting team to watch. Now they'll have more time to prepare. They don't play another game after their first one. So this is their second game of the season, and it's against the Dallas Fuel, who are a good team. But I'm curious as to see what the Charge can do with a little bit more prep time. But I'm going to take the Dallas Fuel because their win against Seoul was pretty convincing. And while they struggled a lot against San Francisco, they look like a very different team against Seoul, so I have them in that one. The other games for that day, I have the Spitfire over the Justice. Spitfire is struggling, but I think the Justice are not good. I think they're just a bad team, so I'm taking the Spitfire over the Justice there. The Philadelphia Fusion over the Florida Mayhem. Once again, the Florida Mayhem just to me look like a weak team. They really did not look good against Atlanta, and they're at full strength. They're at what their team is, and I didn't think they looked very good. I think this meta is not a meta for them, so I need to see a little bit more out of them, but I have to take the Fusion in that one because I just don't think the Mayhem have that talent that they really would like. And then, of course, the Seoul Dynasty taking on the Chengdu Hunters. Chengdu Hunters surprised me with their win over the Guangzhou Charge, but I think the Seoul Dynasty are going to come out hungry after their loss to the Fuel, and I just think the Chengdu Hunters are not good enough to really stop Seoul, so I'm taking Seoul in this one to beat the Chengdu Hunters. Friday, my big pick game for Friday is NYXL taking on the LA Valiant, a rematch of the Stage 4 finals to the two teams that were 1 and 2 in the standings last season for the regular season, not for the playoffs, obviously. I really like both of these teams. I'm taking NYXL mainly because they're NYXL and they are, I still think, a top team. The Valiant played well against the Spark, but I still have questions surrounding the Valiant, and I still think there are some valid concerns surrounding the Valiant. In this 3-3 meta, they didn't play Custa, which I thought was weird. I don't really think Kuki was bad, but I don't really think he was great. I'm going to assume Custa's probably not a fantastic Lucio player, and that's why he wasn't playing, but ultimately I don't really know why we didn't see any Custa, but I just think NYXL looked more solid in their games than the Valiant did, and I think both teams have a very similar playing style. I just think right now New York looks slightly better. But the other games that day, you have the Atlanta Reign and the Toronto Defiant. I thought both teams looked really good this week. The Defiant less so than the Reign. I thought the Reign performed really well against Philadelphia, really well against Florida, and the Defiant had to, of course, reverse sweep Houston, who are looking pretty weak right now, so I'm taking the Atlanta Reign for that one. Boston Uprising over the Shanghai Dragons. It really just comes down to Shanghai haven't looked good yet. Boston have looked very good. I can't pick against Boston anymore. They've been doing really well. I can't pick against them against a team that I don't think is really that good right now. And while Gamsu is on the Dragons, I don't know if he'll be ready quite yet to be a star, and if that team is going to have enough synergy yet to really get things going. So, I'm taking Boston for that one. And I'm taking the Hangzhou Spark or the Houston Outlaws. Hangzhou Spark, arguably the best team in the league right now, against one of the teams that is struggling where I don't think they should be. I think the Spark are a very good team with very good colors as well. Houston Outlaws just can't really stop them based on what I've seen, so I'm taking the Spark. Saturday, my big pick is also the first game of the day, and that is the LA Gladiators and the Paris Eternal. I thought the Paris Eternal looked really good against London. This is a meta that they'll really thrive in this triple meta. And the Gladiators win over Seoul, or not over Seoul, over San Francisco. It was really big as well, and it was really a good thing that the Gladiators definitely needed. These are two teams I think are both really good, but I'm going to lean towards the Gladiators. They have a little bit more experience, and I think that they're going to be a team that is going to be a little bit more difficult to beat for the Paris Eternal than the Spitfire are, or were, and I feel like we haven't really seen the Eternal against the best teams in the league yet. I think London's a little bit weak in this meta, so I'm taking the Gladiators for that one. Philadelphia Fusion against the Dallas Fuel. Big game. Two teams I think look really good. But the Fuel, after their first game, I was very iffy on them. They looked good in their second game, but Fusion, to me, have looked good in both of their games, so I'm taking the Fusion over the Dallas Fuel. Titans, Vancouver Titans against the Guangzhou Charge. Vancouver Titans. Guangzhou, I don't think they're that great. Vancouver looked very good against Shanghai, which wasn't a great team, so I think Vancouver will win this one pretty easily, regardless. Chengdu Hunters against Florida Mayhem. Didn't really think I'd ever pick the Chengdu Hunters over anybody this season, but the Florida Mayhem to me just look really bad. They just look like a team that has no idea what they're doing. They just have looked bad to me the whole time. They got destroyed by a Torbjorn composition. Florida, what are you doing? So yeah, taking the Chengdu Hunters. Sunday, I'm going to do my big pick game last because that's the one I want to talk about the most. But we have the Hangzhou Spark against the London Spitfire. Of course, I'm taking Hangzhou. They look really good. They look really strong. And I don't really see how London would beat them when London struggles in this composition, and Hangzhou have been very good. New York Excelsior taking on the Houston Outlaws. With how disappointing Houston has been and how good New York looks right now, I'm going to take New York. And even still, like, New York could easily lose to the Valiant, in my opinion. Like, the Valiant are a good enough team that they could beat New York. And if that happens, then I definitely don't see New York losing. And Houston has just been so lackluster that I have to pick New York. I mean, it's really not that hard for me. The LA Valiant taking on the Toronto Defiant. That's kind of an interesting one and kind of a tough one to pick because I think the Toronto Defiant are good. I still think they're a dark horse team. I believe that's the final game of Neko's suspension, so they still won't have him. But in the LA Valiant are still a better team. They have more experience. I thought they looked good against Hangzhou, and I think Hangzhou is significantly better than Toronto right now. So, going to take the LA Valiant in that one. Final one, which to me is probably going to be game of the week. Vancouver Titans taking on the San Francisco Shock. Honestly, kind of unfair to the Vancouver Titans. They play a game in back-to-back days, which is rough. Definitely rough having to play 2 games in back-to-back days. It's not really something that you want to ever have to do, but they are doing it. San Francisco, to me, has an advantage, primarily because they don't play any other games in week 2. They played earlier, or they played late in the week for week 1. They played on Sunday, where they played against the LA Gladiators. They lost, of course. They want to bounce back. Vancouver have to really focus on 2 games at one time, while San Francisco can go all in, focusing on 1. That is the end of the second week. So it's gonna be a good game, I think. Vancouver, it was, I believe, Bumper on Vancouver talked mad smack, saying that they would 4-0 everybody they played this season. So I really think San Francisco are going to kind of crack their knuckles and be like, all right, let's play. Let's go. But I just think San Francisco's time that they have to prepare is a huge advantage. They have so much more going for them in that way. So I think the Shock win this one. I think it'll be a really close game. I think it'll be a really good game. But ultimately, I'm going to take the Shock to win that game. So those are my picks. We'll see if I do better this week than I did last week. Real quick, I just want to throw the standings up on the screen for the different divisions, and then I'll go through the top 10 in a second here. But here are the league standings, or the divisional standings. You can see Fusion and Spark, the tops of their respective divisions, and the Spitfire and the Dragons, the bottom of their respective divisions. Some interesting things here. I think it's a little... I mean, week 1 is a little odd and a little weird, and rankings and standings don't really matter. You know, a team like the Florida Mayhem and the Washington Justice, both of them are above the Houston Outlaws because the Houston Outlaws have played 2 games, the other teams haven't. But, you know, the Mayhem got 4-0'd. So, they, like, to me, the Florida Mayhem are the bottom of that division. Right now, I would definitely put the Shanghai Dragons at the bottom of the Pacific Division. But these standings are based on the site. I think you know, the Gladiators are in a good spot. They're in a decent spot. They're not doing too poorly where they are. Guangzhou Charge are sitting pretty low there, but that just ultimately comes down to, once again, they've only played 1 game, they lost. So that to me is relatively accurate, though. That's about where I would expect them to be at this point in the season, especially. It'll be, of course, a long season. There's a lot of stuff that is going to change, most likely. So we'll just have to see how it changes. But ultimately, I'm excited to see where a lot of these teams end up, because it'll be a fun couple of weeks. Stage 1, I think, is going to be a really tough stage for a lot of teams, just with the way the meta is. And I think it's going to be the one that tells us the least about the way the season will end, which is relatively true of what happened last season. Some of the best teams in the early stage, and early stages in general, didn't really finish off that strong, so didn't really matter that much. So it'll be interesting to see what we have going on here, but ultimately I expect a lot of good matches in the next couple of weeks while we get, hopefully soon, to a new hero and the start of a developing new meta that hopefully changes this current meta at least a little bit. But those are your divisional standings. Your overall league standings, as you can see right now, giving you the top 10 there. That's just the playoff standings essentially, but if you count carefully, you'll notice there's 11 teams. That's just because Boston and Seoul are tied, same differential, same record, so I had to throw them both on there because they're technically both the 10 seed. But yeah, some interesting stuff here, I think, when you look at it. I mean, if you, the top 8 teams make it, if you weren't aware. So currently the Atlanta Reign and the Toronto Defiant would be in, the Chengdu Hunters would be in, but and the Shock, Uprising, Dynasty would all be out. But it's been 1 week, so that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So, of course, we'll keep this updated throughout the season. You'll keep seeing it throughout the season. And that'll be that. So that's everything I got for you. Those are my picks. We'll see if week 2 is better than week 1. I don't expect it to be perfect. Definitely not this early in the season. But I expect some, hopefully, good matches once again. But that is everything I have for you. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing. Helps out a bunch with what I've got going on over here. And it lets me know that what I'm doing is doing pretty good. And of course, any feedback is always appreciated as well. But that's everything I have for you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, like I said, do whatever it's whatever. I'm tired. I'm gonna go. Thanks once again, and goodbye.